Today we'll be discussing culture. So what is culture? Culture consists of the shared beliefs, the values, the practices that participants within a specific culture or within a specific society are expected to learn. Culture is typically transmitted from one generation to the next. And it's this idea of how do we become productive members and contributing members of our society. Culture begins to establish the rules that we're expected to follow and also set standards for how those rules are to be enforced. When we think about culture, what we also have to understand is that culture generally exists within a society. And a society is essentially a group of people who share a sense of community and share a culture. And when we use the term community, we're talking about individuals who live in a definable region. Individuals who may live in a neighborhood, who may live in a country, or anywhere in between. And what we want to understand about the relationship between society and culture is that neither can exist without the other, because culture represents the beliefs and the practices of a group, while society represents the people who share those beliefs and practices. As human beings, we know that we're social creatures, and we understand that in order to survive, we need to be able to socialize and to learn from others. We learn common habits and behaviors that are deemed acceptable or unacceptable. We begin to understand what is considered appropriate or inappropriate or right or wrong within our culture and within our society. We also understand that how we engage in behaviors will largely be shaped by how individuals respond to those behaviors. So if individuals respond in a favorable manner, well, we may continue down that trend. But if individuals frown upon our behaviors, it may lead us to rethink the type of behaviors and activities we're engaged in. What we want to understand is that behavior can be deemed normal or abnormal. And for the most part, because we want to join the in group, because we want to be accepted, we have a tendency to engage in behaviors that are deemed normal as opposed to abnormal. As I mentioned before, culture consists of our values and our beliefs, and part of that includes our thoughts. And so we transition into this idea of what is intangible and what are tangible things that exist. And the first thing we're going to discuss is material culture, the objects, the belongings of a particular group of individuals. This can be jewelry. This can be physical structures where we pray or we learn. These can be the metro passes that we use to access public transportation, things that we can physically see and touch. Then we have non-material culture, the intangible parts of life, things that are ideas or attitudes or beliefs that we share with others. And when you think about non-material culture, you think about how we engage in conversation with one another. How do we show people respect? How do we show people appreciation? What are those beliefs that are passed on from one generation to the next? And what we want to understand is that material and non-material culture are oftentimes different based on one region or what culture we're studying. We look at this concept of cultural universals. And these are patterns or traits that are exercised or practiced across multiple societies. How we define the family has evolved. It's evolved from a male-female in a heterosexual relationship and 2-point-something kids to now same-sex couples with no children, same-sex couples with children, single-parent households with one child or multiple children, households that are led by a guardian or by a sibling who's raising their siblings. We have cultural universals with how we conduct funerals and weddings and celebrations of birth. We also look at this concept of ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is very interesting because it essentially says, my culture is the measuring stick by which I'm going to judge all other cultures. My culture is right, your culture is wrong. My culture is superior, your culture is inferior. And when you think about ethnocentric beliefs, they could be as simple as, well, in England, they drive on the wrong side of the road because we drive the right side of the road in America, or the correct side of the road in America. That's a very mild form of ethnocentrism. But it could be as extreme as, well, you know what? We're going to pass legislation against your particular group because we view them as inferior. Think about the Jim Crow era that existed throughout much of American history, that legalized segregation and discrimination against ethnic and racial minorities. That in itself is a form of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism can give birth to disdain and dislike. It can cause misunderstanding and conflict. Ethnocentrism discourages cooperation. And so then we transition from ethnocentrism to this concept of cultural shock. This idea of, well, this is how we do it in our country. Why are you guys doing it this way? If any of you have ever traveled outside the United States, for example, you might find that life in other countries may be vastly different than life in the United States, and that is perfectly fine. We have to stop associating the concept of difference with a negative connotation. Different is just that, it's different. And so you may go to another country, and let's say you have to use the bathroom facilities. In the United States, we typically have private bathrooms or stalls within our bathrooms with toilets. In certain parts of the world, and I'm using my experience having traveled to China before, it took some adjustment. There's a degree of culture shock there. When I went to a public facility and I noticed that there was a large stall with a hole on the ground. There was a learning curve there. And I could have adopted an ethnocentric belief and said, this is way different than the United States. This is wrong. But I understood that, hey, I'm in a different society. And this is how the facilities are. The same thing applies when we go and travel to another country and assume that everyone's going to speak English in another country. I've once dealt with an individual who on that trip to China told me, why can't the people here speak English? And I had to remind the individual that they speak Mandarin, they speak Cantonese, because we are in China. Well, you want to take that in consideration because throughout our everyday lives, we are going to experience culture shock, and we don't have to travel to another country. It may deal with, the next community over, how people prepare the food, what type of food people eat, right? How people celebrate birthdays, how people celebrate funerals. Although those are cultural universals, we may be shocked that they may not subscribe to the same behaviors and activities that our culture subscribes to. To combat ethnocentrism, to combat culture shock to an extent, we can pursue cultural relativism. This idea that we are going to assess, we are going to understand a culture based on its own standards, not ours. That we're going to go in with an open mind and a willingness to learn. That we're going to go into situations understanding that our value system, our understanding of norms is going to also have to evolve. This idea that we look at everything from the sociological perspective as a blank canvas, and we allow the experience to paint a picture for us, as opposed to going in with preconceived notions of what this culture is, or judging that culture. And then we see xenocentrism. And xenocentrism is interesting because it's the opposite of ethnocentrism. It is the belief that another culture is superior to our own. So imagine being a foreign exchange student, you come to the United States, and there are aspects of American life that you like. You return home, and all of a sudden you start saying, we're doing it wrong because in the United States, they do A, B, and C. Well, you're elevating culture in America. above the culture of whatever your respective country is. That is an example of xenocentrism. We understand values, and values are a culture standard for discerning what is good and just in society. And those are deeply embedded and critical to transmitting and teaching culture and cultural beliefs. We look at beliefs from the perspective of these are convictions that people hold true. Individuals in society have specific beliefs, but they also have collective values. For example, we might believe in the American dream, that if you work hard, you can be successful and wealthy. And the underlying belief there is that America values wealth as being very important. What we want to understand about beliefs is that beliefs can vary from culture to culture, from individual to individual. So some individuals may view the American dream as, well, wealth is ultimately what's important. Others may say health. Others may say, hey, my ability for my children to get a quality education and live a life free of struggle. That is their American dream. We have to understand that values begin to shape society. Once again, by suggesting what is good and bad, what is beautiful and ugly, what should be sought or avoided. And you think about the values that we have in the US in regards to youth, that individuals spend millions and millions of dollars every year on cosmetic products, on surgeries, because they want to look youthful, because they want to look beautiful. You think about what our society places value on. And we understand that we have a very skewed perspective and a very hypocritical perspective at times, because we have a tendency to view or to place value on female beauty and female youth. But for men, for males, our value system may be drastically different. Values oftentimes suggest how people should behave, but they don't necessarily reflect how people actually behave. So this leads to a discussion of what is ideal culture and what is real culture. Ideal culture is essentially how should things be done, how we believe things are done. Real culture is this is how they actually get done, or actually are done. It might be an ideal part of culture to suggest that people should be faithful in a monogamous relationship. And I think most people would agree with that. That's an ideal, because real culture tells us that people cheat. Infidelity is a major issue in monogamous relationships for some. We think about how our society upholds values, how we uphold our beliefs. And at times we may place sanctions on individuals. We may reward individuals for adhering to the values and beliefs of our society, and we may punish individuals who engage in behaviors that are counter to that. What we also want to take into consideration is that values are going to vary from culture to culture, and that across time, they are going to change. They are going to evolve to adhere to the times. We look at norms, and norms are the visible and invisible rules of conduct through which societies are structured. What is considered normal behavior? What is considered abnormal behavior? Well, that's going to vary from culture to culture as well. That's going to vary based on our experience. When you think about formal norms, right? Norms that are established, written rules that have been shared with general population, such as laws, for example, employee manuals, college entrance exams. These are all formal norms that are somehow strictly enforced and also are part of our cultural values. We look at informal norms, and these are casual behaviors that are generally and widely conformed to. Right? We conform to them through observation, through imitation, through general socialization. This idea that we don't necessarily have to have explicit rules listed in the law or a rule book in order to adhere to them. We also look at this concept of mores. And mores really focus on the moral views and principles of a group. And violating these mores can have serious consequences, right? It can be punishable by law. You can be removed or ostracized from a group or by a group, right? You may be deemed shameful for violating the mores of a particular group that you belong to. We look at this concept of folkways. Folkways are norms without any moral underpinnings. Folkways direct appropriate behavior in the day-to-day practices and expressions of a culture. When we greet people, do we greet them with a kiss on the cheek? Do we greet them with a handshake? Do we make eye contact? Right? When we go to a wedding, how do we dress? When we go to a funeral, how do we dress? When we go to a party, how do we dress? Well, all these are influenced by folkways. Now, we also want to take into consideration the power of symbols, gestures, signs, objects, signals, words, and how all of these carry with them some level of meaning. And that meaning is going to vary based on the culture that we live in. Because their representation, or rather what they represent, is going to vary from one culture to the next. Some symbols inform us. Other symbols reward us. Other symbols condemn us. You want to take all those factors into consideration when you think about symbols. You want to think about a law enforcement officer and the symbolic meaning of a badge and a uniform. For some individuals, that brings peace and safety. It represents a degree of authority. For other individuals, it may strike terror. It may spark feelings of distrust because of the rough relationship that law enforcement organizations have had with some communities. We think about language and how we communicate. And language is largely how our culture is transmitted from one person to the next. And we understand that language can include symbols that are used for written communication. Other forms of language are only spoken. And when we think about language, we understand that language in itself can be interpreted in many ways. We may have words with dual meanings that in one culture may mean A, and in another culture may mean B. We think about our society, and we think about language, and we think about the rules that are created. And these rules are not necessarily set in stone, but these rules may govern the meaning of certain words. For example, how we use the term soda or Coke or pop to describe carbonated liquid. Perhaps you've been to a restaurant before and you ask, what kind of drink do you have? What kind of soda do you have? And they respond, Coke. And when they bring you your carbonated beverage, it's actually Pepsi. This idea that we may use terms as interchangeably. We may assume that any dark carbonated drink qualifies as Coke. Well, that's going to vary from culture to culture. You think about culture and you think about time period. 40 years ago, if you said the word email or blog, or you said, hey, I'll just order an Uber, they didn't really have a cultural context to those words at that time. It would lead to massive confusion. You think about this concept of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that people begin to experience the world through their language. And they begin to understand their world through the culture that's embedded in their language. And it places an importance on linguistics. That if an individual is not able to explain or to describe their experience through language, the person isn't having an experience. Right? And you think about that particular concept. And you think about how we live in a society today where many individuals feel a need to document their life experiences. If you didn't take a picture or a video, were you really there? Did it really happen? Well, you want to think about how that begins to provide meaning and how that begins to shape people's behaviors. You think about nonverbal communication, and much of our communication is nonverbal. Gestures, facial expressions, right? If you're like my son, the eye roll. Well, all of these can communicate a tremendous amount of messages or feelings without even having a word spoken. You think about high culture versus pop culture, and high culture is typically a representation of the upper class, right? High culture is oftentimes associated with intellectualism or political power or prestige. Pop culture is more mainstream. Pop culture is more accessible. And when you start to think about what is in pop culture today, pop culture is a representation of the working class, of the middle class. And what might be an example of pop culture today may be an example of high culture tomorrow, and vice versa. You look at subcultures, cultures within a culture, a larger culture. And in the United States, you think about ethnic and racial subcultures, the different languages that we speak other than English, how we prepare our food, the type of food we make, the customs that are related to our heritage and our belief system. We exist within the United States, we exist within the American identity, but at the same time, we have our own concept of what that identity looks like. We think about culture and its relationship to innovation and how advancements in technology change our reality. Advances in technology begin to change our culture and how we live our everyday lives, the kind of cultural values that we buy into, and how we express ourselves. You think about the functionalist perspective on culture. And if you recall, functionalism teaches that our society is comprised of these interrelated, interconnected components of our society that interact with one another for the smooth functioning of society, the maintenance of the status quo. And functionalists argue that culture contributes to society because societies need culture to exist. That cultural norms function to support the fluid operation of our society. And cultural values begin to influence people's choices. And by doing so, people are able to fulfill society's needs. This idea that culture allows us to maintain a smooth functioning of society. It teaches everyone their roles and their responsibilities and expectations. Now, a conflict theorist, on the other hand, says, well, let's look at our society. Our society is plagued with injustice and inequality. And what they argue is that culture in many ways reinforces the issue of privilege for certain groups that's based on race or ethnicity, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and social class. That in our society today, our culture continues to be male-dominated. Therefore, many of the organizations, many of the institutions that we witness in our everyday lives that we participate in promote a culture that reflects the ideology of males within our society. It replicates the inequalities that have existed. It develops societal cultural norms that benefit some and hurt others. We look at this concept of symbolic interactionism, the impact and the meaning of symbols, the impact and the meaning of face-to-face interaction. And this idea that in relation to culture, symbolic interactionism can truly shape the beliefs and the values that are passed down from one generation to the next. It can shape the meaning that we place on objects that are passed from one generation to the next. This idea that it can largely shape how we communicate and what we begin to value and place value in. That wraps up our lecture for today.